In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, life was simple. People knew each other by name, kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and everyone felt safe. But one summer day in 2008, something happened that shook the entire community to its core. It wasn't a fire, a storm, or even a crime. It was the sudden disappearance of a 12-year-old boy named Ethan. Ethan lived with his dad, Mark, in a modest house on the edge of town. He was your typical kid, curious, full of energy, and sometimes a little stubborn. On the surface, their family seemed normal, but like many families, they had their share of ups and downs. That particular Tuesday started off as any other day. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and Mark was fixing a car in his garage after finishing breakfast. Ethan, meanwhile, was inside, sulking because he didn't want to clean his room. It all began with a small argument. Mark reminded Ethan about the chores he'd been putting off for days. "You need to take responsibility," Mark said firmly, pointing toward the mess upstairs. Ethan rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. When Mark pressed him further, Ethan snapped back, raising his voice louder than usual. "Why? Do you always nag me? I'll do it later," Ethan shouted before grabbing his backpack and storming out of the house. He slammed the door behind him so hard that the windows rattled. At first, Mark didn't think much of it. Arguments between parents and kids weren't uncommon, especially when children were growing up. Besides, Ethan often went for walks around the neighborhood to cool off whenever he got upset. So Mark shrugged it off and went back to work, figuring Ethan would return home once he calmed down. But hours passed and Ethan didn't come back. Dinner time came and went and still no sign of him. By nightfall, Mark started to worry. He called Ethan's friends, checked the park where they sometimes played baseball, and drove around town looking for him. Each empty street corner made his heart sink a little more. Where could Ethan be? When morning arrived without any news, panic set in. Mark reported Ethan missing to the local police, who immediately launched a search effort. Flyers with Ethan's picture were plastered everywhere, on telephone poles, store windows, and mailboxes. Volunteers joined the search parties, combing through nearby woods, rivers, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the area from above. Everyone hoped against hope that Ethan would turn up soon. Days turned into weeks, and then months. Despite countless interviews, searches, and tips from strangers, there was no trace of Ethan. No ransom demands, no suspicious sightings, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The lack of answers left the townsfolk baffled and heartbroken. For Mark, the pain was unbearable. Every unanswered phone call, every dead-end lead felt like another nail in his coffin of despair. As the months dragged on, life in Maplewood slowly returned to normal, for everyone except Mark. His wife couldn't handle the strain and left him, unable to cope with the constant grief. Friends stopped calling as frequently, unsure of what to say. The house grew quieter, emptier, filled only with memories of Ethan. Mark spent his nights staring at old photographs, clutching a baseball glove they used to play catch with. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking he heard Ethan's laugh echoing through the halls, only to realize it was just the wind outside. Every year on the anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, Mark visited the park where they used to spend hours playing together. He'd sit on the same bench, holding that worn-out baseball glove, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, Ethan might walk through the trees and greet him with a smile. But the years ticked by, and Ethan remained gone. By the time 15 years had passed, Mark was a shadow of the man he used to be. He worked long hours at a mechanic shop to keep himself busy, though his mind was never far from thoughts of Ethan. Some evenings, he'd stop by the bar down the street, nursing a drink, while replaying the events of that fateful day over and over in his head. What if he hadn't pushed Ethan about cleaning his room? What if he'd followed him when he stormed out? Would things have been different? Despite the passage of time, Mark refused to give up hope. Deep down, he clung to the belief that Ethan was still alive somewhere. Maybe he'd run away and built a new life, or maybe he was lost, waiting for someone to find him. Whatever the case, Mark vowed to never stop searching, not until he had answers. One rainy Saturday morning, feeling restless and aimless, Mark decided to visit a flea market on the outskirts of town. It was a place he rarely went, but today, he needed a distraction. As he wandered through rows of stalls selling everything from handmade crafts to second-hand furniture, he stumbled upon a tiny junk shop tucked away in a forgotten corner. Something about the cluttered storefront caught his eye. A mix of curiosity and nostalgia pulled him inside. Little did Mark know, this seemingly random decision would change his life forever. Among the piles of discarded treasures lay a clue that would reignite his search for Ethan and bring him closer to the truth than he ever imagined possible. 15 years is a long time to carry the weight of unanswered questions. For Mark, those years felt like an endless loop of heartache and regret. Every morning, he woke up with the same hollow feeling in his chest, as if part of him was missing. And, in a way, it was. Ethan's absence wasn't just a void. It was a constant ache that never faded no matter how much time passed. Mark tried to keep himself busy. He worked long hours at the mechanic shop, fixing cars and tinkering with engines until his hands were blackened with grease. The physical labor helped numb his mind for a while, but the silence of the evenings always brought everything rushing back. When the workday ended, he'd return to the same quiet house where memories of Ethan lingered in every corner. The creaky floorboard near the stairs, the faded scuff marks on the walls from when Ethan used to race toy cars indoors, the faint smell of pancakes that still seemed to hang in the air from lazy Sunday mornings. On weekends, Mark often drove around neighboring towns, stopping at diners, gas stations, and small shops. He'd show people Ethan's picture, a photograph taken during a family picnic years ago, and ask if they'd seen anyone who matched the description. Most people shook their heads politely, offering condolences before moving on with their day. A few offered vague stories about seeing someone who might have looked like Ethan, but none of the leads panned out. Each dead end chipped away at Mark's hope, but he refused to let go completely. Some nights, after too many drinks at the bar, Mark would sit alone in his truck, staring at the old baseball glove resting on the passenger seat. It had been Ethan's favorite, a gift from Mark when he turned 8. They used to spend hours tossing the ball back and forth in the park, laughing and teasing each other whenever one of them missed a catch. Now, the glove sat untouched, its leather cracked and stiff from years of neglect. Holding it in his hands made Mark feel closer to Ethan, even if only for a moment. Over the years, friends and neighbors urged Mark to move on. "You can't keep living like this," they'd say gently. "Ethan wouldn't want you to waste your life searching for him." But Mark couldn't imagine doing anything else. To him, giving up meant accepting that Ethan was truly gone. And he wasn't ready to face that possibility. Instead, he clung to the tiniest slivers of hope, no matter how unlikely they seemed. One rainy Saturday morning, Mark found himself wandering through a flea market outside of town. He didn't have a specific reason for going. It wasn't like he needed anything, but the thought of staying cooped up in the house all day felt suffocating. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time he arrived, leaving the ground muddy and slick. Vendors huddled under makeshift tents, calling out to passers-by to browse their wares. There were tables piled high with vintage jewelry, stacks of dusty books and bins overflowing with knickknacks collected over decades. As Mark wandered aimlessly through the rows of stalls, his eyes landed on a tiny junk shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of the lot. Its storefront was unassuming, just a rickety wooden sign hanging above the door that read "Treasures and Trinkets." Something about the place intrigued him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way the sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the cluttered shelves inside. Or maybe it was the faint sense of nostalgia that washed over him as he peered through the window at the jumble of items displayed within. Curiosity got the better of him, and Mark stepped inside. The shop smelled faintly of wood polish and damp paper, a mix of scents that reminded him of his grandfather's attic. Shelves lined the walls, crammed full of objects both ordinary and strange. A chipped ceramic teapot, a stack of vinyl records, a framed black and white photograph of strangers smiling in front of a farmhouse. In the center of the room stood a long table covered with random odds and ends. Old keys, mismatched buttons, postcards yellowed with age. Mark began sifting through the piles, running his fingers over the worn surfaces of forgotten relics as he picked up a tarnished silver locket and opened it to find an unfamiliar portrait inside. He couldn't help but wonder about the lives these items once belonged to. Who had cherished this locket? What stories did these objects hold? The thought sent a pang of longing through him, reminding him of all the unanswered questions about Ethan's life, or whatever remained of it. Then, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic buried beneath a pile of old magazines. He pulled it free and froze. In his palm lay a silver bracelet engraved with the initials EH. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized it instantly. It was Ethan's. The bracelet had been a gift from Mark on Ethan's 10th birthday. It was simple yet meaningful, a token of love and pride. Ethan had worn it every day since receiving it, refusing to take it off even when it got caught on things or left marks on his wrist. Seeing it now, years later in a dusty junk shop miles away from home, felt surreal. Mark's heart raced as he turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. There was no mistaking it. This was Ethan's bracelet. Shaken, Mark approached. The shopkeeper, a wiry old man with thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose. The man sat behind a counter, flipping through the pages of a newspaper with a look of mild disinterest. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. "Where did you get this?" He held up the bracelet, his grip tightening around it as if afraid it might disappear again. The shopkeeper glanced up, squinting at the object in Mark's hand. "That? Came in a box of stuff I bought at an estate sale last month. Why? You know whose it is?" Mark nodded slowly, struggling to find words. It belongs to my son. He went missing 15 years ago." The shopkeeper's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know much about where it came from, but the box had some papers in it too. Might be worth checking out." Without hesitation, Mark paid for the bracelet and rushed out of the shop, his mind spinning. How had Ethan's bracelet ended? Up here? And what did it mean? For the first time in years, Mark felt a spark of hope ignite within him. This wasn't just a random coincidence, it was a clue, a breadcrumb leading him closer to the truth. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the bracelet as if it might reveal its secrets if he looked hard enough. He traced the engraved letters with his thumb, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The discovery had reignited something deep inside him, a fierce determination to uncover what had happened to Ethan. Whatever it took, wherever it led, Mark vowed to follow the trail until he found answers. The next morning, Mark woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The bracelet sat on the kitchen counter, gleaming faintly in the early sunlight streaming through the window. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a lifeline, a tangible connection to Ethan that had been missing for so long. For the first time in over a decade, Mark felt like he was moving forward instead of standing still. He knew he couldn't waste any time. If the bracelet had come from an estate sale, there had to be a way to trace its origin. Mark drove back to the junk shop as soon as it opened, determined to get more information from the shopkeeper. The old man was arranging a display of vintage clocks when Mark walked in, his face lighting up with recognition. "I need to know more about where this came from," Mark said, holding up the bracelet. "You mentioned an estate sale?" The shopkeeper nodded slowly, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, I picked up a whole bunch of stuff at an auction last month. It was from a storage unit that belonged to some woman who passed away. Don't remember her name off the top of my head, but I think I've got the paperwork somewhere." Mark's heart raced as the shopkeeper shuffled through a stack of papers on a nearby shelf. After a few moments, he pulled out a crumpled receipt and handed it to Mark. "Here you go. Says the unit belonged to someone named Margaret Lane. She lived in a town about an hour from here." Margaret Lane. The name didn't mean anything to Mark, but it was a lead. A real, solid lead. He thanked the shopkeeper profusely before rushing out of the shop, his mind already racing ahead. Who was Margaret Lane, and how did Ethan's bracelet end up in her possession? Tracking down Margaret Lane back home. Mark spent hours poring over maps and searching online for information about Margaret Lane. He eventually discovered that she had lived alone in a rundown apartment complex just outside Maplewood. Her obituary mentioned that she had no immediate family or close friends, which explained why her belongings had ended up in a storage unit auction. But none of this answered the most pressing question. What was her connection to Ethan? Determined to find out, Mark decided to visit the apartment building where Margaret had lived. It wasn't far, just a 20-minute drive from his house, but the neighborhood looked worlds apart from the quiet streets of Maplewood. The buildings were weathered and gray, their paint peeling in large patches. Weeds sprouted between cracks in the sidewalk, and stray cats darted across empty parking lots. It was a place that seemed forgotten by time. Mark parked his truck and approached the main entrance cautiously. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew, and the walls were covered in faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. An elderly tenant, sitting in a chair near the mailboxes, eyed him curiously as he stepped inside. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice raspy but kind. Mark showed him a picture of Ethan. "I'm looking for information about a boy who might have lived here years ago. His name is Ethan. Do you recognize him?" The man squinted at the photo, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Doesn't ring a bell, but wait. You said years ago? There was a kid who used to visit one of the tenants back then. Skinny little thing, always wearing a hoodie. Came around maybe once or twice a week." Mark's pulse quickened. "Do you remember who he visited?" "Yeah, that reclusive lady on the 3rd floor. Margaret, I think her name was. Kept to herself mostly, but I'd see her talking to the boy sometimes. Never heard them argue or anything. They seemed friendly enough." Friendly enough? Mark clenched his fists involuntarily. How could Ethan have ended up visiting someone like Margaret? Was she helping him? Or had something darker happened? Searching the apartment. With permission from the building manager, Mark gained access to Margaret's old apartment. It had been vacant since her death, and the air inside was thick with dust and the musty scent of neglect. The furniture was sparse, a worn couch, a rickety table, and a single bed pushed against the wall. But the space told a story. As Mark began searching, he noticed signs that someone else had spent time there. A torn photograph taped to the wall caught his eye. It was barely recognizable, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a school portrait of Ethan. Someone had carefully cut it out, leaving jagged edges where it had been ripped from its original frame. Nearby, he found a pair of sneakers, tucked beneath the bed. They were small, clearly belonging to a child or teenager, but the most significant discovery came when he opened a drawer in the bedside table. Inside was a tattered journal filled with handwritten entries. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, but unmistakably that of a young person. Flipping through the pages, Mark felt tears welling up in his eyes. These were Ethan's words, his thoughts, fears, and dreams scribbled onto paper during what must have been some of the darkest days of his life. One entry stood out. "I don't know if Dad is looking for me anymore. Does he even care? Margaret says she'll keep me safe, but I hate it here. I want to leave, but I'm scared of what will happen if I do." Another read. "She locked me in today because I tried to run away. I can't stay here forever. I need to find a way out. Maybe tomorrow." Each word pierced Mark's heart like a knife. He had spent 15 years blaming himself for not stopping Ethan from leaving that day. But now he realized the truth was far worse. Ethan hadn't simply run away. He had been trapped, held captive by someone he thought he could trust. Piecing together the puzzle, Mark took the journal and other items back home, spreading them out on his dining table. As he read through the entries again, he started piecing together fragments of Ethan's journey. From the journal, it became clear that Margaret had promised Ethan safety and shelter, but had instead isolated him, keeping him confined to her apartment. Eventually, Ethan had managed to escape, fleeing to a bigger city hundreds of miles away. Using clues scattered throughout the journal, mentions of landmarks, bus stations, and street names, Mark mapped out a possible route Ethan might have taken. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him direction. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he was getting closer. not just to finding answers, but to finding Ethan himself. That night, as he sat alone in the dim glow of a desk lamp, Mark allowed himself a moment of hope. 15 years of searching, of waiting, of wondering if Ethan was alive or dead, all of it had led him here. Tomorrow he would begin the next chapter of his quest, driven by the belief that somewhere out there, his son was still fighting to survive. And this time, Mark wouldn't stop until he brought him home. With the journal clutched tightly in his hands, Mark sat at his kitchen table late into the night, piecing together Ethan's story. Each entry was like a shard of glass reflecting fragments of the past, painful, sharp, but necessary to understand the full picture. The more he read, the angrier and sadder he felt. Margaret had betrayed Ethan's trust, luring him with promises of safety, only to trap him in her isolated world. But despite the anger boiling inside him, Mark forced himself to focus on the details that mattered most, the clues hidden within the journal. Ethan had written about landmarks he'd seen while trying to escape, bus stations, train platforms, and even specific streets in cities far from Maplewood. He mentioned catching a bus to Chicago after leaving Margaret's apartment, describing the chaos of Union Station and the overwhelming crowds. There were also references to shelters where he'd stayed briefly before moving on, too afraid to settle in one place for too long. These were the breadcrumbs Mark needed to follow. The journey begins. Early the next morning, Mark packed a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, some cash, and copies of the journal entries he thought might be useful. He didn't know how long this search would take or what obstacles he'd face along the way, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't wait another day. This wasn't just about finding Ethan anymore. It was about making things right, about proving to his son that he hadn't given up, no matter how many years had passed. Mark drove to Chicago first, guided by the descriptions in the journal. When he arrived, the city felt both massive and impersonal, its towering skyscrapers casting long shadows over bustling streets. Union Station was exactly as Ethan had described it, crowded, noisy, and chaotic. Mark wandered through the terminal, imagining Ethan standing there years ago, scared and alone, trying to figure out his next move. He approached the information desk, showing the attendant Ethan's old photograph. "Have you ever seen this person?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The attendant shook her head apologetically, but suggested he try nearby shelters and community centers. People who ended up in situations like Ethan's often sought help in those places. A glimmer of hope over the next few days, Mark visited every shelter and soup kitchen he could find, showing Ethan's picture to anyone who would look. Most people shook their heads, saying they didn't recognize him, but a few offered vague recollections. One volunteer at a men's shelter remembered seeing someone matching Ethan's description years earlier. "He came here once or twice," the man said. "Quiet kid, kept to himself, said he was looking for work." Another lead came from a social worker named Lisa, who ran a program for homeless youth. She flipped through her records and found an old intake form signed by a teenager using the alias Alex. The handwriting matched the journal entries, and the birth date listed was close enough to Ethan's real age. Lisa explained that Alex had stayed at the shelter intermittently, working odd jobs to get by, but eventually disappeared again. "He talked about wanting to start over," Lisa told Mark. "Said he wanted to leave his old life behind completely. But I don't think he trusted anyone, not even us." Hearing these details filled Mark with conflicting emotions. On one hand, it was clear that Ethan had survived against incredible odds, building a fragile new existence for himself despite everything he'd been through. On the other hand, the thought of Ethan living on the streets, struggling to survive without family or support, broke Mark's heart all over again. One step closer, Lisa pointed Mark toward a network of organizations that helped reunite missing persons with their families. Through them, he learned about a database of names and photos collected over the years from various shelters and outreach programs. It took hours of searching, but finally, something clicked. A grainy security camera image from a downtown shelter showed a young man whose features strongly resembled Ethan. The timestamp indicated the photo had been taken just a few months ago. Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the screen, Could it really be him? After 15 years of searching, was this finally proof that Ethan was still alive? Encouraged by the discovery, Mark reached out to the shelter where the photo had been taken. The staff confirmed that the man in the image occasionally stayed there, though they hadn't seen him recently. They provided Mark with the name of another shelter across town where Ethan, or Alex, had reportedly gone after leaving theirs. Facing uncertainty. By the time Mark arrived at the second shelter, exhaustion was setting in. Days of driving, questioning, strangers, and chasing leads had taken their toll. Still, he pushed forward, determined not to let anything stand in his way. Inside the shelter, he spoke to a counselor who recognized Ethan's photo immediately. "Yes, he's been here," the counselor said. "He goes by Alex now. He doesn't talk much about his past, but we've tried to help him whenever we can. If you're family, I can give you his contact information, but I should warn you, he might not want to see you." Mark nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. 15 years was a long time to carry resentment, pain, and fear. Even if Ethan was alive, there was no guarantee he'd welcome his father back into his life. But Mark refused to let that stop him. He had come too far to turn back now. The moment of truth. Armed with Ethan's current location, Mark made his way to a modest apartment building on the outskirts of the city. His heart pounded as he climbed the stairs to the third floor, each step bringing him closer to the moment he'd dreamed of for so many years. Standing outside the door marked 3B, he hesitated, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Then, with trembling fingers, he knocked. For a few seconds, there was silence. Mark wondered if he'd gotten the wrong address, if this was all, just another dead end. But then the sound of footsteps echoed from inside. The door creaked open, and there he was, older, thinner, and weathered by years of hardship, but unmistakably Ethan. At first, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other, the weight of 15 lost years hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Mark broke the silence, his voice cracking with emotion. "Ethan, it's me, Dad." Ethan's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, it seemed like he might slam the door shut. Instead, he stepped aside, motioning for Mark to come in. As they sat down together in the tiny living room, surrounded by the remnants of Ethan's new life, Mark realized this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. Rebuilding their relationship wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Mark allowed himself to believe it was possible. And in that moment, hope flickered back to life. The moment Ethan opened the door, Mark felt a rush of emotions he hadn't prepared for. 15 years of searching, wondering, and hoping had led him to this exact spot. To his son, standing right in front of him. But as they sat together in the cramped, dimly lit apartment, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Ethan wasn't the same boy who had stormed out of their house all those years ago. He was older now, hardened by life on the streets, carrying scars, both visible and invisible. That told stories Mark couldn't fully understand yet. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions, guilt, and pain. Mark wanted to say so many things. To apologize for not being there, to explain how much he'd searched for him, to tell him how sorry he was for every mistake he'd made as a father. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just looked at Ethan, trying to memorize every detail of his face, afraid that if he blinked, this moment might disappear. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "How did you find me?" Mark held up the journal he'd brought with him. "I found this in an old apartment. It helped me figure out where you might be." Ethan's expression darkened as he glanced at the worn-out notebook. "That's mine," he said flatly, reaching out to take it from Mark's hands. For a moment, he flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing over the messy handwriting. Then he closed it abruptly and set it aside, as if touching it brought back memories he didn't want to relive. "I thought you stopped looking for me," Ethan said after another long pause. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a sadness in his voice that cut deep. "I thought you gave up." Mark shook his head quickly, leaning forward in his chair. No, never. I never stopped looking for you, Ethan. Not for one day. I've spent years driving around showing your picture to strangers, following every lead I could find. I didn't know what happened to you, but I always believed you were still out there somewhere. Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. You don't know what I went through, he muttered under his breath. You have no idea. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words. He knew he couldn't pretend to understand everything Ethan had endured, the loneliness, the fear, the betrayal, but he also knew he had to try. You're right, he admitted softly. I don't know exactly what you went through, but I'm here now, and I want to listen. I want to help however I can. Rebuilding trust, for the next few days, Mark stayed in Chicago, spending as much time with Ethan as he would allow. At first, Ethan kept his distance, reluctant to let his guard down. He answered Mark's questions in short, clipped sentences, and avoided talking about his past unless absolutely necessary. But gradually, as they spent more time together, small cracks began to form in the walls Ethan had built around himself. One evening, while sitting on the couch in Ethan's tiny apartment, Mark noticed a stack of textbooks on the coffee table. Are you studying something? He asked, pointing to the books. Ethan shrugged, glancing at the titles. Yeah, I'm taking some classes at the community college, trying to get my GED. It's hard, though. Working full-time and going to school isn't easy. Mark smiled faintly, pride swelling in his chest. Despite everything Ethan had been through, he was still fighting to build a better future for himself. That's amazing, Mark said sincerely. I'm proud of you. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but Mark could see a flicker of emotion cross his face, a mix of surprise and maybe even gratitude. Over the next hour, they talked about Ethan's plans for the future. He admitted that he dreamed of becoming a carpenter someday, inspired by the hours he'd spent watching builders work during his time on the streets. Listening to him talk about his goals reminded Mark of the curious, determined boy Ethan used to be, and gave him hope that they could rebuild their relationship. Facing the past as the days passed, Ethan slowly began opening up about his experiences after leaving home. He told Mark about Margaret, the woman who had promised to protect him but instead isolated him in her apartment. He described the fear he felt when she locked him inside and the relief he felt when he finally managed to escape. Mark listened intently, his heart breaking with every word. I tried to run away a few times before I left for good, Ethan explained. But she always caught me. She said no one else cared about me, that I'd end up dead if I left. I believed her for a while anyway. Mark clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him at the thought of someone treating his son like that. But he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that lashing out wouldn't help. I'm so sorry, Ethan, he said quietly. I wish I could go back and fix everything. I should have protected you better. Ethan shook his head. It's not your fault. You didn't know what was happening, and honestly, I don't blame you anymore. I blamed you for a long time. I thought you didn't care about me. But now I realize you were probably just as lost as I was. Hearing those words was like a punch to the gut for Mark. He had spent 15 years blaming himself for Ethan's disappearance, convinced that he had failed as a father. To hear Ethan say otherwise was both comforting and heartbreaking. Thank you for saying that, Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But I promise you I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. We'll figure this out together. A new beginning. By the end of the week, Ethan agreed to visit Maplewood with Mark. It wasn't an easy decision. He hadn't been back to the town since the day he ran away, and the thought of returning terrified him. But Mark assured him that they could take things slow, that there was no pressure to dive back into the life they once shared. When they arrived, the familiar sights and sounds of Maplewood brought a flood of memories rushing back for both of them. Mark showed Ethan around the neighborhood, pointing out places that held significance. The park where they used to play catch, the diner where they'd grab milkshakes after school, the treehouse in the backyard that Mark had built for him when he was little. At first, Ethan seemed distant, overwhelmed by the wave of nostalgia. But as they walked through the park and sat on the same bench where Mark had waited for him every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, something shifted. Ethan started sharing stories too, memories of their time together that he hadn't forgotten despite everything that had happened. "It's weird being back here," Ethan admitted as they watched the sunset. "Part of me feels like I don't belong anymore, but another part of me, I don't know, feels like maybe I'm home." Mark smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. "You'll always belong here, Ethan. No matter what happens, this will always be your home, and I'll always be here for you." Moving forward in the weeks that followed, Ethan decided to enroll in a trade school near Maplewood, where he could pursue his dream of becoming a carpenter. Mark sold the family house and moved into a smaller apartment closer to Ethan, wanting to be nearby without crowding him. They took things one step at a time, learning how to navigate their new dynamic as adults rather than parent and child. There were challenges, of course. Years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, and there were moments when old wounds resurfaced. But through it all, they leaned on each other, determined to heal and grow together. For Mark, finding Ethan wasn't just about closure, it was about redemption. For Ethan, reconnecting with his father was a chance to reclaim the love and support he'd been missing for so long. Together, they proved that even after years of loss and longing, family could find its way back to each other again. And as they stood side by side one crisp autumn morning, hammering nails into a birdhouse Mark had bought as a gift for Ethan's new workshop, it was clear that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they faced it with hope, not just for the future but for each other. As the weeks turned into months, Mark and Ethan slowly began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, awkward silences, and old wounds that flared up unexpectedly, but they were learning how to move forward together. For both of them, it was a delicate balancing act. Ethan trying to trust again and Mark working tirelessly to prove that he deserved that trust. One of the biggest changes came when Ethan decided to fully commit to his dream of becoming a carpenter. He enrolled in a local trade school near Maplewood, where he quickly became one of the most dedicated students in his class. Every morning he'd wake up early, pack his tools, and head to campus, determined to make the most of this second chance at life. Watching him thrive gave Mark a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. Mark tried to stay involved without being overbearing. He'd drop by the school occasionally to see Ethan's progress or offer to help with projects if needed. At first, Ethan was hesitant about accepting his dad's assistance, worried it might feel like charity. But eventually he realized Mark wasn't doing it out of pity. He genuinely wanted to support him. One afternoon, while helping Ethan sand down a wooden table they were building together, Mark smiled and said, "You've got real talent for this, you know." Ethan shrugged modestly but couldn't hide the small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he replied quietly. "It feels good to actually create something, you know, something solid." Mark nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. After so many years of instability and uncertainty, creating something tangible must have felt like reclaiming control over his life. And for Mark, seeing Ethan find joy in his work reminded him of the boy who used to build tree houses and fix broken toys with such enthusiasm. Shared moments. Outside of school and work, Mark and Ethan started spending more time together. They weren't rushing anything. They knew rebuilding their bond would take time, but they found comfort in simple shared moments. On weekends, they'd go fishing at a nearby lake, sitting quietly on the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon. Other times, they'd cook dinner together in Mark's apartment, experimenting with recipes and laughing at each other's cooking mishaps. One evening, while flipping pancakes on the stove, Ethan glanced at Mark and said, "You're not half bad at this parenting thing, you know." Mark chuckled, pretending to be offended. "Half bad? That's all I get?" "Well, let's not get carried away," Ethan teased, earning a playful swat from the spatula. Though their banter was light-hearted, it carried a deeper meaning. These small exchanges were proof that they were finding their way back to each other, not as father and son trapped in the past, but as two people building a new connection based on honesty and mutual respect. Healing old wounds, of course, there were still challenges along the way. Conversations about the past often brought painful memories bubbling to the surface. One night after a particularly tough day at school, Ethan opened up about some of the darkest moments he'd faced during his years away from home. "I used to think no one cared about me," he admitted, staring at the floor. "Not just you, but anyone. There were nights when I'd lie awake wondering if my life even mattered. It sounds stupid now, but back then, it felt real." Mark listened silently, his heart aching for the pain his son had endured. When Ethan finished speaking, Mark reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your life matters, Ethan, more than you'll ever know, and I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me most. But I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan didn't respond right away, but after a moment, he nodded slightly. "I believe you," he said softly. Those 3 words meant everything to Mark. They were proof that Ethan was willing to give him another chance. A new chapter. By the end of the year, Ethan graduated from trade school with honors, an accomplishment that filled both him and Mark with immense pride. During the ceremony, as Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Mark couldn't stop smiling. He clapped louder than anyone else in the audience, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son step confidently into the next phase of his life. Afterward, they celebrated with a small gathering at Mark's apartment. Friends, teachers, and classmates joined them, congratulating Ethan on his hard work and dedication. As the evening wound down, Ethan pulled Mark aside and handed him a small, neatly wrapped gift. "What's this?" Mark asked, surprised. "Just open it," Ethan replied with a grin. Inside the box was a handmade wooden frame, crafted with precision and care. Inside the frame was a photograph of the 2 of them standing side by side, holding up the birdhouse they'd built together earlier that year. Beneath the photo, Ethan had engraved a short message. "To Dad, thanks for never giving up." Mark stared at the gift, overwhelmed with emotion. "This is incredible," he managed to say, his voice cracking. "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed but pleased. "Figured it was time I gave you something to hold on to. You've been holding on to me for long enough." Looking ahead with his diploma in hand and a bright future ahead of him, Ethan landed a job at a local construction company. The work was demanding, but he loved every minute of it. Seeing his designs come to life, whether it was a custom bookshelf or a renovated kitchen, filled him with a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Meanwhile, Mark continued to support Ethan in whatever ways he could. He attended every project unveiling, cheered loudly at Ethan's soccer games — he'd recently joined a recreational league — and made sure to remind him regularly how proud he was. Their relationship wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, raw, and rooted in love. On the anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, Mark suggested they visit the park where they used to play catch. This time, though, instead of sitting alone on the bench, they brought along a baseball and glove. As they tossed the ball back and forth under the golden afternoon sun, Mark realized something important. They weren't just healing from the past. They were creating new memories, ones that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. A second chance in the end. Their story wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. 15 years of separation had taken its toll, leaving scars that would never fully fade. But those scars also served as reminders of how far they'd come. Through patience, forgiveness, and unwavering determination, Mark and Ethan had found their way back to each other. For Mark, the journey had taught him that love isn't always about protecting someone from harm. It's about standing beside them, even when they stumble, and helping them rise again. For Ethan, it was a lesson in trust and self-worth, proving that no matter how broken things seemed, hope could always lead to healing. And as they stood together in the park that day, laughing and playing like they used to, it was clear that their family wasn't defined by the years they'd lost. It was shaped by the love they refused to let go of, no matter what.